The crowd had already begun to lose interest when the old man stepped through the maintenance gate. 79-year-old Walt Brennan walked slowly across the vehicle yard at the U.S. Army Armor Heritage Center in Fort Benning, Georgia, leaning on a weathered hickory cane and carrying a faded canvas toolbox that looked almost as old as the tanks surrounding him. A restored M60 Patton sat in the center of the yard, its engine compartment open, while a team of young military mechanics argued over yet another failed attempt to start it. They had spent nearly 6 hours replacing batteries, checking fuel lines, and inspecting electrical systems. Nothing worked. One technician looked at the elderly visitor and laughed. "Sorry, sir. Museum tours are on the other side." Another pointed toward the silent tank. "Unless you've got a magic wrench, nobody's getting that engine running today." The group chuckled. Walt smiled politely and set his toolbox on the ground. "Mind if I take a look?" More laughter followed. "That tank weighs 50 tons, one mechanic joked. "It hasn't cared about old stories in years." Walt slowly walked around the vehicle without saying another word. He rested one hand against the cold steel hull and quietly closed his eyes for a moment, as though greeting an old friend he hadn't seen in decades. Chief Maintenance Officer Sergeant Major Frank Collins noticed the gesture immediately. Without hesitation, he walked across the yard and came to attention. "Master Sergeant Brennan," he said with unmistakable respect, before rendering a crisp salute. Every senior mechanic froze. The younger technicians looked at each other in confusion. None of them knew why the most experienced armor mechanic on the base had just saluted an elderly civilian carrying a battered toolbox. 45 years earlier, Master Sergeant Walter Brennan had been one of the Army's most respected armored vehicle recovery specialists. During his career, he became famous for restarting battle-damaged tanks that everyone else believed were beyond repair, often under enemy fire and with little more than basic tools and instinct. More importantly, one particular M60 had carried the crew that became his family and the final mission they never all came home from. Within the next half hour, the mechanics would discover why Walt never allowed anyone else to touch that faded canvas toolbox, uncover the heartbreaking reason he still visited the Armor Heritage Center every year, and witness an elderly veteran diagnose a silent tank in less than 30 seconds using nothing but his ears, his hands, and 40 years of forgotten experience. The sound of metal tools echoed across the U.S. Army Armor Heritage Center long before visitors arrived that morning. Inside the restoration yard at Fort Benning, Georgia, a team of young military technicians surrounded a restored M60 Patton battle tank. With growing frustration, the massive engine had refused to start since sunrise. Batteries had been replaced. Fuel lines had been inspected twice. Every electrical connection had been tested. Still, the 50-ton machine remained silent. "Try it again," one mechanic called. The starter groaned for a few seconds before dying once more. Another technician slammed the engine hatch shut. Nothing. Chief Maintenance Officer Sergeant Major Frank Collins quietly watched from the edge of the yard. He had seen stubborn machines before, but something about this one felt different. "Stop," he finally ordered. "You're listening to your equipment." The mechanics looked confused. "Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" Frank slowly shook his head. "You're listening to your tools." Before he could explain further, the security gate quietly opened. 79-year-old Walt Brennan stepped through carrying a faded canvas toolbox in one hand and a polished hickory cane in the other. He wore an old Army field jacket with no medals, no ribbons, and no visible signs of rank. Most people walking past would have assumed he was simply another retired veteran visiting the museum. Every October, on the same morning, Walt appeared without fail. He never announced his arrival. He never asked for attention. He simply walked through the restoration yard, spent a few minutes beside one particular M60 Patton, and quietly left before lunchtime. Frank Collins spotted him immediately. A smile crossed his face. "Morning, Master Sergeant." Walt smiled back. "Morning, Frank. Right on time. The tank would complain if I wasn't." Frank laughed softly. The younger mechanics exchanged puzzled glances. One whispered, "Who is he?" Another shrugged. "Probably one of the volunteers." Walt slowly approached the silent M60, resting beneath the maintenance shelter. He gently placed his toolbox on the concrete before running one weathered hand across the tank's thick steel armor. His fingers paused over several small scratches near the driver's hatch. He smiled almost imperceptibly. Still carrying those scars, one of the younger technicians watched curiously. Sir? Walt looked up. Yes? You know this tank? Walt nodded once. Very well. The young mechanic grinned. Good. He pointed toward the open engine compartment. Maybe you can convince it to start. Several technicians laughed. We've been fighting this thing for 6 hours. Another joked, unless your toolbox has a miracle inside it. This old girl isn't going anywhere. Walt chuckled softly. No miracles. Then what's in the box? Walt gently rested one hand on the faded canvas lid. Memories. More laughter followed. Frank Collins heard every word but remained silent. Experience had taught him that some lessons are most powerful when people discover them for themselves. Walt slowly walked around the M60 without touching a single tool. He crouched beside one track, examined several worn road wheels, then moved toward the rear engine deck. He placed one hand against the steel grille and quietly closed his eyes. The younger mechanics exchanged amused smiles. What's he doing? One whispered. Listening, Frank answered. To what? Frank smiled faintly. The tank. A loud burst of laughter came from the group. It's an engine, one mechanic said. Not a person. Walt opened his eyes again and gently tapped one section of the engine compartment with 2 fingers. Then another. Then he smiled. She's trying. One technician shook his head. Sir? With all due respect. He folded his arms confidently. Machines don't try. Walt looked at him kindly. The good ones do. Just then, Frank Collins walked toward the elderly veteran and came to a perfect military salute. Master Sergeant Walter Brennan, he said proudly. Welcome back. The laughter stopped instantly. Every senior mechanic standing nearby immediately raised their own salute. The younger technicians stared in complete confusion at the quiet old man standing beside the silent tank, still wondering why the most experienced armor specialists on the base had just saluted someone carrying a battered toolbox instead of a rank badge. The restoration yard fell completely silent after Sergeant Major Frank Collins saluted Walter Brennan. The younger technicians looked from the old man to the senior mechanics. Unable to understand what they were witnessing, Walt returned the salute with the calm precision of someone who had repeated the movement thousands of times during a lifetime in uniform. Good to see you again, Frank, he said with a warm smile. She's giving you trouble? Frank nodded toward the silent M60. Since sunrise, Walt chuckled softly. She always was stubborn on cold mornings. Several young mechanics exchanged confused looks. One finally asked, Sir, were you part of the restoration team? Frank smiled. No. Then how does he know the tank? Frank folded his arms. Because before this machine became a museum exhibit, he looked toward Walt. It belonged to him. Murmurs spread through the yard. Walt gently shook his head. Not to me. He rested one weathered hand against the steel hull. To all of us. Frank nodded respectfully. Fair enough. One young technician stepped forward. Master Sergeant, were you a tank commander? Walt smiled. No. Driver? No. Loader? Walt laughed. I spent most of my career covered in grease. The technicians looked puzzled. Frank answered for him. Master Sergeant Brennan was one of the Army's best armored vehicle recovery specialists. He pointed toward the M60 when everyone else gave up on a damaged tank. He smiled. They called Walt. Another mechanic frowned. Recovery specialists don't usually become legends. Frank's expression became serious. He wasn't ordinary. He looked at the younger technicians. During one deployment overseas, he restarted 3 disabled tanks under enemy fire, with almost no equipment. 3? Someone whispered. Frank nodded. And every crew made it home. The yard became quiet again. Walt slowly walked to the rear of the M60 and carefully removed a pair of worn mechanic's gloves from his faded canvas toolbox. The leather was cracked with age, and the fingertips had been repaired so many times that almost none of the original stitching remained. You still use those? Frank asked. Walt smiled. They still fit. One of the younger technicians laughed nervously. Sir, we've already checked everything. Walt nodded. I believe you. The batteries are new. Good. Fuel pressure is correct. Excellent. Electrical system passed every test. Walt smiled gently. I'm sure it did. The young mechanic looked confused. Then what's left? Walt slowly climbed onto the rear deck of the tank with surprising confidence despite his age. He knelt beside the open engine compartment and simply rested one hand on the engine block. He didn't pick up a wrench. He didn't disconnect a cable. He closed his eyes. What's he doing? A technician whispered. Frank answered quietly. Listening. To an engine that isn't even running? Frank smiled. Exactly. For nearly 30 seconds, Walt remained completely motionless. Then he tapped one fuel line twice with his finger, tilted his head slightly, and smiled. There you are. He opened his eyes and looked toward the mechanics. May I borrow a screwdriver? A young technician quickly handed him one. Walt loosened a small inspection cover, no larger than the palm of his hand. Inside sat a simple mechanical linkage connected to the fuel shutoff assembly. Walt gently moved it less than half an inch. Who adjusted this? The mechanics looked at one another. We all did. Walt nodded kindly. That's the problem. He opened his eyes and looked toward the mechanics. May I borrow a screwdriver? A young technician quickly handed him one. Walt loosened a small inspection cover, no larger than the palm of his hand. Inside sat a simple mechanical linkage connected to the fuel shutoff assembly. Walt gently moved it less than half an inch. Who adjusted this? The mechanics looked at one another. We all did. Walt nodded kindly. That's the problem. One young mechanic shook his head. That's impossible. We already tried everything. Walt simply stepped back and folded his arms. Frank climbed into the driver's compartment without another word. The younger technicians watched skeptically. Convinced nothing had changed, Frank pressed the starter. For one brief second, the yard remained silent. Then the massive diesel engine roared to life with a deep, familiar rumble that echoed across the entire restoration center. Thick gray smoke rolled from the exhaust before clearing almost immediately into the steady rhythm of a perfectly running engine. Every technician stood frozen. Not a single person spoke. Walt quietly smiled as he rested one hand against the vibrating steel hull. Good morning, old girl, he whispered. I knew you still remembered. The deep roar of the M60 Patton echoed across the restoration yard, and for several long moments no one moved. The younger technicians simply stared at the running engine they had spent 6 frustrating hours trying to revive. Sergeant Major Frank Collins climbed out of the driver's hatch wearing the wide smile of a man who had just witnessed something extraordinary for the 100th time. Runs exactly like she used to, he said. Walt Brennan gently rested one hand against the steel armor, feeling the steady vibration beneath his fingertips. She always had a beautiful heartbeat. One young mechanic shook his head in disbelief. How did you know? Walt smiled. She told me. A few nervous laughs followed. Seriously, sir. Walt looked toward the engine compartment. Every machine has a personality. The mechanic frowned. Machines don't have personalities. Frank quietly interrupted. The good ones do. The yard fell silent again. One of the younger technicians stepped closer to the tank. What was actually wrong? Walt pointed toward the tiny linkage he had adjusted. Mechanically? He smiled. Almost nothing. Then why wouldn't it start? Walt leaned against the side of the tank. Because someone adjusted the fuel shutoff exactly the way the manual said. The mechanics looked even more confused. Isn't that correct? Walt nodded. For a brand new tank, he gently tapped the thick armor. She's almost 50 years old. Frank smiled knowingly. Middle ages. Walt nodded. Steele remembers. One technician quietly repeated the words. Steele remembers? Walt looked across the yard filled with restored military vehicles. Every machine carries the story of the people who worked beside it. He gently ran his hand across several old scratches near the driver's hatch. These weren't made in a museum. The mechanics followed his hand. What happened there? Walt smiled faintly. Tree line. Tree line? Our driver squeezed through a gap that was about 6 inches narrower than he thought. Laughter spread across the yard. Walt chuckled. He insisted it wasn't his fault. Frank laughed. Was it? Absolutely. The younger mechanics smiled for the first time that morning. Then one of them noticed something unusual, painted almost invisibly beneath several restoration layers near the front hull. Sir. He leaned closer. Are those names? Walt's smile slowly faded. He carefully wiped away a thin layer of dust with his sleeve. 4 faded names appeared beneath the paint. Jack, Eddie, Louis, Walt. Silence settled over the yard. Your crew? The young mechanic asked softly. Walt nodded once. Best crew in the army. Frank quietly lowered his head. Every October, he said to the technicians. Master Sergeant Brennan comes here because today is the anniversary. The mechanics looked at him. Anniversary of what? Walt remained silent for several seconds before answering. Our last mission together. The engine continued idling steadily behind him. We were sent to recover another disabled tank after dark. His eyes remained fixed on the faded names. Everything went according to plan. He paused. Until it didn't. The younger mechanics listened. Without making a sound, we managed to recover the other crew. Walt smiled sadly. That part worked. His voice became quieter. On the way back, he gently touched the second name, Eddie. An anti-tank mine exploded beneath us. No one spoke. Walt slowly moved his hand across the remaining names. Jack survived. His fingers rested on the third name. Luis survived. Finally, he stopped over Eddie. Eddie didn't. The yard became completely silent except for the steady rumble of the engine. One young technician whispered, "I'm sorry." Walt smiled gently. "So am I." Frank stepped beside him. That's why he never lets anyone repaint those names. Several mechanics looked again at the faded letters beneath the old paint. You could barely see them. Walt nodded. "That's enough." One technician quietly asked, "Why leave them there?" Walt looked at the running tank. "Because as long as they're still on this steel." He rested one hand on the warm armor. "My crew still comes to work with me." No one laughed this time. They finally understood that the old M60 had never been just another museum vehicle. To Walter Brennan, it was the last place where four friends had ever been together. The restoration yard remained silent, as the old M60 continued idling with its familiar deep rumble. None of the young technicians looked at the tank the same way anymore. They no longer saw steel, gears, or an aging diesel engine. They saw the memories of four soldiers who had once trusted one another with their lives. Walter Brennan quietly climbed down from the hull and reached for the faded canvas toolbox resting beside his cane. One of the younger mechanics noticed how carefully he lifted it. "Master Sergeant," he asked gently, "why have you kept that toolbox for so long?" Walt smiled without opening it. "Because it already knows every tank I ever worked on." A few of the mechanics smiled softly. Frank Collins stepped closer. "Show them." Walt hesitated for a moment, before slowly releasing the worn metal latches. The lid creaked open. Inside were not expensive specialty tools or modern diagnostic equipment. Instead, neatly arranged in faded cloth compartments, lay a handful of old wrenches, screwdrivers polished smooth by decades of use, a grease pencil, a military flashlight, and a small brass hammer with its wooden handle darkened by countless repairs. Resting carefully beneath them was a folded black and white photograph. Walt gently picked it up. Four young soldiers stood beside the same M60, covered in grease and smiling at the camera. "Jack." He pointed to the driver. "Luis." He smiled toward the loader. "Eddie." His finger paused on the mechanic standing beside the engine compartment. Finally, he pointed to himself. "And me." The young technicians studied the picture in silence. One finally asked, "Who took the photograph?" Walt laughed quietly. "A lieutenant who was angry because we'd spent more time fixing tanks than saluting officers." Even Frank laughed at that. The smiles faded when Tyler, one of the youngest mechanics, noticed something else inside the toolbox. Tucked beneath the photograph was a small, worn notebook with oil stains covering almost every page. "What's that?" Walt carefully opened it. Every page contained handwritten notes, rough sketches of engines, measurements, tiny diagrams, and short sentences written in pencil. "These aren't army manuals," Tyler said. Walt shook his head. "No." "Then what are they?" Walt smiled. "Everything the manuals forgot to mention." The mechanics gathered closer. One page read, "If the engine sounds tired on cold mornings, check the fuel linkage before blaming the batteries." Another read, "Never trust a perfect measurement on an old machine. Wear changes everything." Another simply said, "Listen before you touch anything." Frank smiled. "We've been teaching those lessons for years." Walt looked surprised. "Really? Every new mechanic who trains here learns them?" Walt chuckled softly. "I don't remember writing anything important." Frank looked at him. "You wrote everything important." A quiet silence settled over the group. Tyler carefully turned another page before stopping. Taped inside the notebook was a small, folded letter. The paper had yellowed with age. "May I?" he asked. Walt nodded. Tyler unfolded it carefully. It was written in Eddie's handwriting. "Walt, if this old toolbox ever outlives both of us, promise me one thing. Never let anyone believe machines are just metal. Every tank carries the people who trusted it to bring them home. If they remember the machine, maybe they'll remember us too." Tyler looked up with moist eyes. "He wrote this before." Walt nodded quietly. A week before the mission, no one spoke. Frank gently closed the notebook. "Now you understand why he never replaced the toolbox. Walt smiled. Every scratch on it belongs to someone I miss. Just then, the museum director entered the yard carrying a polished wooden display case. Master Sergeant Brennan, she said respectfully. The board voted unanimously this morning. Walt looked puzzled. About what? She smiled warmly. We'd like to place your toolbox in the museum as a permanent exhibit. The younger mechanics nodded immediately. It seemed like the perfect tribute. Walt looked down at the faded canvas box for several long seconds before gently shaking his head. Not yet. Why not? The director asked. Walt smiled kindly. Because there are still young mechanics who need to borrow a wrench. Every person in the yard smiled. In that moment, they realized the old toolbox had never been a museum piece. It was still doing exactly what its owner believed it had always been meant to do, helping someone else bring another machine and another memory back to life. The story of what happened in the restoration yard spread quickly through the Army maintenance community. There were no television cameras and no official ceremony. The story traveled the same way the best stories always do, from one mechanic to another, from one maintenance company to the next, from veterans to young soldiers who had never even seen an M60 Patton in active service. Soon, mechanics visiting the Armor Heritage Center began asking a different question they no longer asked. Can we see the old tank? They asked. Is Master Sergeant Brennan here today? Walt usually was. Every Saturday morning he quietly arrived, carrying the same faded canvas toolbox, wearing the same worn Army field jacket, and smiling at anyone willing to learn. Before long, young mechanics from bases across the country began gathering around him. They expected to hear stories about combat, broken engines, and impossible battlefield repairs. Instead, Walt walked to an old workbench, picked up a piece of chalk, and wrote 3 simple sentences on a blackboard hanging above the maintenance bay. Every machine tells the truth. Listen before you repair. Never forget who trusted it to bring them home. Then he spent the next 2 hours talking almost entirely about responsibility. The best mechanic, he often said, isn't the one who fixes the most engines. He smiled at the students gathered around him. It's the one whose work keeps someone else's family from receiving bad news. Those words quickly became part of the culture inside the Restoration Center. Senior mechanics repeated them during training. Apprentices copied them into notebooks. Some even taped handwritten versions inside their toolboxes before every shift. Tyler Reynolds, the young technician who had laughed at Walt on the day they first met, eventually became one of the Army's finest armored vehicle mechanics. Years later, after earning his own senior maintenance certification, Tyler returned to Fort Benning, carrying a brand new toolbox. He quietly placed it beside Walt's old canvas. Master Sergeant, he said with a smile. I finally wore out my first toolbox. Walt laughed softly. Good. Tyler looked surprised. Good? Walt nodded. It means you spent more time using it than polishing it. Frank Collins laughed. Still teaching with one sentence. Tyler reached into his new toolbox and removed a small brass plate. I had this made. He handed it to Walt. The plate read, Every repaired machine carries someone's hope. Walt smiled quietly before placing it inside his old toolbox. Eddie would have liked that. Several years later, the Army Armor Heritage Center dedicated an entire section of the restoration building to the history of battlefield recovery mechanics. Walt agreed to donate his toolbox at last, but only under one condition: don't display it closed. The museum director looked puzzled. Why? Walt smiled. Leave it open. For what reason? So young mechanics remember that tools are meant to be picked up, not worshipped. The director smiled. Done. After Walt passed away peacefully at the age of 88, soldiers, mechanics, veterans, and families gathered inside the restoration hall where the old M60 Patton now stood, with its engine quietly idling for one final tribute. Tyler, now the chief maintenance officer himself, carefully placed Walt's faded canvas toolbox beneath the driver's hatch exactly where it had rested for decades. Beside it lay the worn mechanic's gloves, the grease-stained notebook, the brass hammer, and the black and white photograph of 4 smiling crewmen standing beside the same tank many years earlier. A simple bronze plaque completed the display. A great mechanic is remembered not for the engines he repaired, but for the people who reached home because he refused to give up on them. From that day forward, every new mechanic assigned to the Armor Heritage Center stopped beside Walt's toolbox before touching a wrench for the first time. Most believed they were looking at a collection of old tools. The instructors knew better. They were looking at 40 years of patience, loyalty, craftsmanship, friendship, and love preserved inside a faded canvas box, because Walter Brennan had spent his life proving that repairing a machine was never really about steel, bolts, or engines. It was always about bringing someone's family back together again. Machines do not remember the people who built them, but people remember the machines that carried them through the hardest days of their lives. A tank is made of steel, gears, fuel, and engines. Yet for the soldiers who served inside it, it also becomes something far more meaningful. It becomes the place where friendships are formed, fears are shared, promises are made, and lives are entrusted to one another. Walter Brennan understood that truth every time he laid his hand against the old M60. He never returned to the Armor Heritage Center to prove he was still the best mechanic. He returned because that quiet machine was one of the last places where he could still feel close to the friends who never truly left his heart. Eddie, Jack, Luis, and Walt had once trusted that tank to bring them safely home. Even after decades had passed, Walter believed that remembering the machine also meant remembering the people whose laughter, courage, and sacrifice had filled it with life. Eddie's final letter carried a lesson that reaches far beyond military service. He wrote that machines are never just metal because every vehicle carries someone's hope of returning home. The same is true in every profession. Behind every tool, every uniform, every vehicle, and every piece of equipment stands a human life depending on someone else's dedication. Excellence is never only about doing a job well. It is about protecting people we may never even meet. The young technicians made the same mistake many of us make throughout life. They judged an elderly man by his age instead of his experience. They saw an old toolbox and assumed it belonged in a museum. They forgot that wisdom often arrives, wearing worn gloves and carrying faded memories instead of polished trophies. Then, in less than 30 seconds, they discovered that true mastery cannot always be measured by modern technology. Sometimes it lives inside patient hands that have spent decades learning to listen before acting. Walter often reminded his students that every machine tells the truth if we are willing to listen. Life speaks in much the same way. Problems usually reveal themselves long before they become disasters. Relationships, families, friendships, and communities all leave quiet signals when they need care. Those who learn to slow down, pay attention, and truly listen often solve problems before anyone else even realizes they exist. Perhaps the most beautiful moment in this story was not when the old tank roared back to life. It was when 4 faded names beneath layers of paint reminded everyone that the greatest repairs are not always mechanical. Sometimes the most important thing we restore is memory. Every generation has a responsibility to preserve the stories of those who came before them, because as long as those stories are remembered, the people inside them are never completely gone. If this story touched your heart, please leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. Have you ever known a veteran, mechanic, teacher, parent, mentor, or friend whose quiet wisdom changed the way you see the world? We'd be honored to hear your story. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories about veterans, family, sacrifice, faith, courage, honor, second chances, and the ordinary people whose quiet acts of service continue changing lives long after they are gone. May God bless you and your loved ones. Watch over every service member standing watch around the world. Strengthen every mechanic whose careful hands keep others safe. Comfort every family carrying memories of someone they dearly miss. Guide every young person willing to learn from those who came before them. And remind all of us that true craftsmanship is never measured only by what we repair. It is measured by the lives that continue safely forward, because we cared enough not to give up. And may you never forget that sometimes the most powerful engine in the world is not the one inside a tank. It is the faithful heart of the person who refuses to stop bringing others home.